Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had someone ask me in the comments yesterday, what do I think about landmine rows and do I consider them to be an acceptable replacement for barbell rows? And that led me to a whole train of thought of something I should probably discuss in a full video. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Now, I'm not going to say that one arm and one leg exercises don't have their place as secondary or accessory exercises for some athletes, right? For some people. However, what I'm going to say is for general fitness, for general strength training purposes, for even for general overall hypertrophy purposes, these are usually going to be inferior exercises. And you know, this came up because of the Kinobody video yesterday and the one-legged squats and stuff. And what I'm getting at with all of this is that, again, you have people like Kinobody trying to promote athleticism instead of just physique. You know, it's one thing if you're going to run around and say, well, I only care about my physique, and I don't care at all how strong I am, how fit I am, how well I can perform at any sport, how athletic I am, right? That's a different thing. But the moment you start talking about, hey, man, I want to reduce my injury rate, hey, I want a stronger core, hey, I want to be more athletic, this is where we run into problems with a lot of this stuff. And yeah, I know this is going to be controversial to say, but a lot of it has to do with, for example, how many of these guys out here seem to need to add all this core work, right? They need to add tons and tons of core work. They're like, I got to train my abs and my core and stuff every day. You guys see where I'm about to go with this? Doing too many one-armed and one-legged exercises is the reason your core is weak. That's the reason your core is weak. And people say, well, I don't want to overdevelop my abdominal wall. And it's like, you know how hard it is to do that. The guys you see who have an overdeveloped abdominal wall are abusing mind-boggling amounts of drugs. All right, that's not from lifting weights. That's not from doing heavy squats and heavy barbell rows, guys, okay? That's from drugs, or they're fat. Like even me, people will talk about, you know, my waistline and everything. Yeah, well, as I get leaner, it's going to get a lot smaller. Yes, I do all this stuff that builds my core, but, you know, honestly, to actually add a couple inches of waist circumference through sheer muscle mass requires an enormous amount of muscle growth. These are not really thick muscles that, you know, are going to grow out the way that you think they will. You're never going to add 5 inches to your waistline just by getting your squat up to 600 pounds. That's what I'm trying to say. Hopefully people understand what I'm saying there. You're not going to see that sort of enormous growth. You're going to see a little bit of growth. But I mean, realistically, to actually add an inch of muscle, of true muscle mass to your waistline, particularly if you got a good body composition, it requires a whole lot of work. That's not something that can just be easily done in a couple years' time. So what I'm getting at with all of this is that what you're seeing are people who are like, well, I can do a fair amount of weight with one leg, you know, on a squat. Well, then they have no core. They have no trunk. And then that carries over when you see them actually have to deadlift or do something. And here's the thing I would say as far as athleticism and stability and everything else goes. Can you name me any sport, any serious sport? Because if we're going to talk about being athletic, any serious sport where there is such a thing as too much core strength? Or is it usually the case of most athletes, and particularly contact sports? I mean, something where you're going to get hit, where anyone ever said, man, I think my core is just too strong? Or is it the opposite of they always want a stronger core? They want as strong of a core as possible. You do realize that doing one-legged work also puts half the weight on your core. Do people think that we do squats and push presses and deadlifts and all this stuff just to make each leg stronger? Or do you think it's to make your whole body stronger, and particularly to strengthen your entire trunk? I'm talking all the muscles in there. Your abdominals, your obliques, your spinal erectors, everything else, all those smaller muscles, right? We do these exercises to strengthen the entire trunk. The moment you start doing them on one leg, you are losing that ability. Because I'm going to tell you right now, there is no amount of one-legged dumbbell squats or Zercher squats or anything else that will ever build your trunk musculature to the same degree that 400-pound squats and 500-pound deadlifts will. All right, it can't be done. You're not going to do it. And, unless you're an 800-pound squatter, then you might be able to get enough on some one-legged stuff to do it. But, for people who only squat 500 pounds or less, that one-legged stuff is not contributing to much else besides maybe your quads. So the same problem we run into when we start talking about like the one-arm row or even chest-supported rows. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the same thing. If you're doing stuff to reduce the load on a row on your lower back and your posterior chain, which are important muscles involved in the barbell row, why don't you just do a pull-up? Pull-up's a great exercise. You go ahead and move your body through space. Do a pull-up instead. I'm sorry, but anytime people are doing seated rows or even the same thing, I'm going to do these one-arm. Well, what benefit do you think you're getting by doing a one-arm bent-over row? Or I guess it's a landmine row is what they're calling it. What benefit do you think you're getting out of this? You're like, okay, yeah, you're working your lats, your biceps, your rear delts. Fine. But you are losing additional trunk involvement. You are losing a lot of the benefits of a standing row by doing it with one arm. Now, some people are going to say, well, my core, my trunk and everything are so fatigued. Well, maybe you need to improve their work capacity. Or maybe you need to be looking at maybe your overall training volume itself is too high. Or you just still have a weak trunk and you need to fix that. Because ultimately, things like the barbell row, it carries over to a lot of other lifts. We think of it even for power lifters, it carries over to your squat, bench, and your deadlift. Why? Well, the bench is obvious because of all the back involvement and everything. Why does it carry over to your deadlift and your squat? Because you're training yourself to use your back while you're driving through the heels. There's additional trunk involvement, a little bit of hip, a little bit of all your posterior chain, your spinal erectors, all of this stuff is getting worked. The moment you start doing it with one arm, you've now just cut the load in half. As far as what's bearing down on there, you're putting less stress on the body. You're going to get less total muscle growth even if the lats grow the same. But here's what you're doing. You're also taking twice as long to train. You're not only doubling the time of your sets, you're now putting less stress on your trunk, which means if you wanted to get the same strength and same muscular development, you now have to add more sets to all your core work. And it's the same the moment people start doing these one-legged exercises. You now have increased your need to have to do additional sets for your core. And you're still not going to get the same effect. But that's the point, guys. These big exercises, they load the body structurally. They load the entire trunk. They load the whole body. That is why they produce so much muscle growth. That's why they produce so much strength. And I would suggest to people who say, well, this person has really wide, I don't know, they're too wide all through that area from doing all of that. Well, no, guys, that's because a lot of us have higher body fat still. It's exactly what it is. It has nothing to do with they've built too much muscle through there. Because then you go look at some of these guys who do have really good big lifts, who are lean, and you don't see that same problem, do you? I mean, are any of you guys look at Dmitry Klokov? Even you physique guys, are you going to look at someone like him and say, oh man, he doesn't have a fantastic physique. Man, he would look better if he just didn't have as strong of a core. Have any of you ever looked at Dmitry Klokov and said that? Have you ever looked at what this man can squat? You ever looked at what he clean and jerks? All right. So put that in perspective when you look at all these big, heavy structural lifts of how much he loads his trunk with. And it's not excessively overdeveloped in proportion to his body. And he looks like an athlete. The dude looks like a ridiculous athlete. That's an example of what we're talking about here. When you're leaner, it's not what people are thinking of. You're only seeing guys who are fat or guys who are abusing heavy amounts of bodybuilding drugs. That's where you're getting these ideas. It's not from actual athletes who are at a lower body fat, even ones who are brutally strong. So what I would suggest here is that most of these exercises are a piss poor use of your training time. because they cannot produce as much total muscle growth through the body. They cannot produce as much strength. They're not going to give you all the additional heavy loading on the body, the trunk, everything else, the things that really, really benefit you in terms of being an athlete. And then they're therefore not going to give you as much carryover, because the way that we need to look at it, all of our listening to work in synergy. Every single exercise that you do needs to flow into another exercise. In other words, every single exercise that you select, I don't care what your goals are, needs to be an accessory for some other movement that you do. That way, every lift that you improve upon has the potential to improve your performance at everything else that you do. So that as you get stronger on one lift, you get stronger. And if you get stronger, you become a better athlete in many ways. You develop more muscle mass. It makes you better overall. And so that's kind of the problem I have with a lot of these exercises. Because they start using less total muscle mass, they become inferior accessory movements for all the other stuff that you're doing. Therefore, they can really be an unproductive use of your overall training time. They're just not an efficient use of your time. There are other things that can do everything that you were trying to do with them better. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.